All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Tactical Nutrition and Performance Database group coaching call. Let me move that out of the way. I'm Susan Lopez, tactical dietitian, and today we are going to be learning a little bit about caffeine. And after we're done with our discussion today, what I'm going to do is take a couple of questions if you guys having any related to today's topic, or really just any nutrition questions in general related to your programming. As you're going through the Tactical Nutrition and Performance Database and you're learning the material, remember that these sessions are an opportunity for you to actually meet with me one-on-one, discuss the material that you're learning, and ask questions specific to your programming. That's kind of one of the nice benefits of the Tactical Database membership is you get to have a little bit of semi-private time with me to really discuss your goals, your programming, and what it is that you're working on. So really take advantage of these sessions when you have them. We had previously been holding them on Saturdays, but based on some feedback that we got, we decided to move them into the week, into the evening time when you guys might be a little bit more freer with your time. So hopefully this works for everybody. And we plan on keeping it towards the end of the month, the third Thursday at this time, moving forward for right now anyway. So what we're going to do today, like I said, is we're going to really be discussing caffeine intake. And whenever I'm talking about caffeine, it seems like this topic just gets you guys really excited. And I can only surmise that it's because we function day to day so heavily reliant on our caffeine. And I know there's some of you out there who don't utilize caffeine at all. And we're going to kind of go over really what kind of effects caffeine can have on your health and performance, what the appropriate dosage is if you're looking to stay healthy or maybe even increase your performance. There's a lot of common questions that I get asked around caffeine intake. So we're going to discuss some of those today and talk about what are ways that you can really maximize your utilization of caffeine if you're someone who likes to use pre-workout or coffee, or perhaps you're even someone who partakes in energy drinks. Let me fix my screen here real quick, guys. Give me 1 second. My notes are a little weird. Okay. All right, so let's talk about caffeine, right? So when we're talking about caffeine, most people, or when I talk to people, always ask me, is caffeine okay to have? Is it bad for me? Is it good for me? How much should I be taking? And for a long time, I feel like in the dietetic community, even when I was coming up through my undergrad and whatnot, I feel like people were always very like, oh, coffee's okay, but, energy drinks, not so much. Or, there's, if you really want to be healthy, you shouldn't have caffeine at all. And we know that from a performance standpoint, that that's just not the case. Caffeine, when used responsibly, can actually be fantastic for enhancing physical performance and mental performance. But there is a fine line between appropriate caffeine use and caffeine abuse. So we're going to kind of discuss what that looks like today. The typical recommendation for anybody who's utilizing caffeine supplementation, as far as how much you should be using, is usually going to be at about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day in general. So typically for most individuals, this is going to put your recommended caffeine intake right around somewhere between 200 to maybe 400 milligrams per day. Now, obviously, the heavier you are, the higher your caffeine upper limit recommendations are going to be. But for most of us, it's probably going to be somewhere around that 200 to 400 milligram mark. Now, typically, an intake of caffeine somewhere around 300 milligrams per day or more is going to be considered high caffeine utilization. If you look at a lot of your energy drinks that are coming on the market now, a lot of them are going to have right around 300 milligrams of caffeine in them. So if you're having multiple energy drinks per day, this can potentially be problematic. And we're going to talk about some of the negative effects of caffeine later on as well. But anything over that 300 milligrams is going to be considered high caffeine use. Now, when we're using caffeinated products, right, it's not just energy drinks, there's regular coffee out there. So your typical 8-ounce cup of drip coffee, I don't know who only drinks 8 ounces of drip coffee, but your typical 8-ounce cup of plain black coffee is usually going to run you somewhere between 80 to 100 milligrams of caffeine, assuming that it's just, your regular roasted coffee, right? We're not talking about Cuban coffee or espresso or anything like that. The roast of your coffee matters. So typically the lighter the roast of the coffee, the higher the caffeine content is actually going to be. So like that blonde, what is it, Verdanda, or that coffee that you get at Starbucks, the light blonde, it's actually a heavily caffeinated coffee. And this is a common misconception that I come across a lot too, is people think that light roasts typically mean less caffeine. But that's not actually the case. A light roast would indicate that coffee has been roasted for less time and typically is going to have more caffeine still in it because it hasn't been roasted for as long. So your typical blonde roast at Starbucks is actually going to contain just a tall, about 270 milligrams of caffeine, right? So even your regular drip coffees can be extremely high in caffeine. So you have to be kind of cognizant of that. You have to be aware of that. The little freeze-dried packets of coffee usually have more caffeine in them as well. So you can see upwards of 100 milligrams or more in just one of those. So for instance, if you're utilizing meals ready to eat, the instant coffee packets in there are sometimes going to be higher in caffeine than your regular drip coffee. So when we're looking at utilizing caffeine, right? What are some of the benefits that you could potentially see when you're using caffeinated products? Well, the way that caffeine works, it works a couple of different ways. So caffeine exerts a stimulatory effect on your muscles and your cells. And even with your central nervous system, there is the situation where caffeine will actually mask your fatigue by blocking something called adenosine receptors. And adenosine receptors is typically how we experience fatigue, or one of the ways that we can experience fatigue, particularly in the central nervous system. So caffeine kind of blocks that. So it can actually mask our fatigue. And it does have a stimulatory effect and can affect things like our heart rate, our blood pressure. Caffeine can also increase some of your hormones as well. So some of your catecholamines, epinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol can all be affected by caffeine intake. Now, there is some speculation out there. There are some studies out there that shown that caffeine can also have a positive effect on fat burning, that it can also have a positive effect on endurance exercise, strength training exercise. But there are some nuances to this, because one of the things that we have to remember is that the timing of when you take in your caffeine and the amount of the caffeine that you take in on a regular basis is really going to matter in how effective the caffeine that you use is going to be, because you can actually build up a tolerance to caffeine. And over time, the positive effects that you would see from smaller doses of caffeine, you would need to take higher doses to really get that same effect. And typically, when we start to reach over that 5 to 600 milligram limit of caffeine, that's where you really start to see tolerance, and you're not going to have any more significantly positive benefits from that intake. You have that tolerance, and you actually have to remove caffeine, limit your caffeine intake in order to rebuild that tolerance so that that caffeine can then have that positive stimulatory effect on your performance again after you've kind of cleaned your body out from it. So you have to keep that in mind. If you're regularly taking in over 300 milligrams of caffeine on a daily basis, the likelihood that it's actually providing a performance benefit is very small, right? So typically what you're going to see with athletes is they will limit their caffeine intake during training. They will then utilize caffeine during an event or their culminating event in order to get those benefits of caffeine utilization. So one example where that might be beneficial for somebody working in the tactical space would be if you were getting ready for like an academy physical fitness test, or if you were getting ready to perform a PT test, you could potentially use small amounts of caffeine prior to testing to stimulate the central nervous system and to also support any muscular strength or endurance activities that you're actually doing. And again, staying within those therapeutic doses of about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight can potentially be effective. Remember that kilograms is not the same as pounds. So in order to figure out what your dosage needs to be, you would need to take your body weight in pounds divided by 2.2, and that will give you your weight in kilograms. And then you can multiply that by 3, and that will give you your performance effective dose. Now, when should you be taking it? So the half-life on caffeine is somewhere between 4 to 6 hours. Now, if you are sensitive to caffeine, it can potentially be a little bit longer, right? Everybody's different. But for most people, it's going to be right around 6 hours. So you want to start taking that caffeine in about 30 to 45 minutes prior to an event. Your caffeine levels are going to peak somewhere between 4 to 6 hours. And then somewhere around 8 to 12 hours is typically when you're going to be close again to that baseline prior to when you took in the caffeine. Okay, so the timing matters. This is another reason that oftentimes when we're talking about caffeine utilization in sleep, that we recommend that you minimize your caffeine intake for 6 hours or so prior to actually laying down, going to sleep, so that that caffeine that's in your system is not then also disrupting your sleep. Because we can get into this cycle if we're overutilizing caffeine where you are taking in caffeine in too high of amounts, or you're taking it too close to when you should be going to bed. And then it can be a sleep disruptor and also increase sleep onset. So we want to be careful of that. When you're in a situation where you might be utilizing caffeine to stay awake, either for training, operations, extended details, just anything where you have to stay awake, usually you're going to want to dose caffeine every 2 to 3 hours. You still want to try and minimize your intake of caffeine that 6 to 8 hours prior to actually wanting to go to sleep. So for instance, once you get on your shift, you would want to take in about 200 milligrams of caffeine. And then every 2 hours, you would want to redose that 200 milligrams of caffeine until you hit about that 6-hour window. This is typically going to be the best way to make sure that you're getting caffeine in the appropriate dosages. Again, you just have to be careful of building that tolerance level, because then it becomes less effective, right? So when we're also looking at some of the side effects of too high of a caffeine intake or caffeine utilization, there are negative side effects. So some of those side effects are going to include increased heart rate, because remember we said that caffeine does affect the muscle tissue, anxiety, dizziness, insomnia, sleep disruption, irritability. We kind of talked about that already. Sometimes people will experience shakes as well. I will tell you that, like on a personal level, if I take in too much caffeine without having enough in my stomach, I will very often get a little bit of the jitters. So you do have to be careful of that, especially if you're pulling operations or you're in a situation where accuracy is going to be important, where having a steady hand is going to be important, where decision making is going to be important. I actually had a discussion with Dr. Creatine, Mr. Scott Forbes, the other day, whose podcast I just released today. So you can find that on the website. You can find that on Spotify, on YouTube. And we were actually talking about utilization of caffeine and creatine. And one of the things he mentioned on there is caffeine doesn't necessarily mitigate any mistakes you might make, but sometimes it just helps you make those mistakes faster, right? So that's another reason to be very cognizant of the amount of caffeine that you're taking in when you really need to sort of be in that attentive state. So when we're looking at some additional side effects, sometimes people experience stomach discomfort. I mentioned anxiety earlier. I will tell you that I am very aware of my caffeine intake. And you guys know, if you've been following me for some time or if we've talked, that I love caffeine in all forms. I like coffee. I do like sugar-free energy drinks. I will occasionally use pre-workout, but I can be aware enough of what's going on internally with me that I can tell when the amount of caffeine that I'm taking in, and even the type of caffeine that I'm taking in, is really taking its toll on my ability to sleep well. And even I will tell you, if I've had too many days in a row where I've had energy drinks, I can actually feel my anxiety levels actually increasing a little bit. There is some discussion around the amount of excitotoxins in energy drinks that you're not necessarily going to find in regular coffee. So it shouldn't be surprising that sometimes when you're using alternative sources, of caffeine, that you can experience different neurological effects. So typically when that happens and I become aware of that happening, I'm usually going to draw down on my usage of any type of energy drinks or pre-workout stimulants. And if I'm going to continue to use caffeine, I'm typically going to use coffee. And this has sort of a twofold effect on my body's ability to tolerate caffeine and process caffeine and use it smartly. So when I'm pulling away from the energy drinks a little bit and I'm moving back into coffee, this helps me actually decrease my tolerance levels over the course of a few weeks, so that if I go back to using higher amounts of caffeine for whatever reason that may be, sometimes it's just pleasure, then oftentimes I have to, less caffeine will give me the same effect as the higher amounts of caffeine that I was previously taking. So that tolerance that I talked about earlier. So the challenge I would have to you is, as you're using different types of caffeine, are you aware of the amount of caffeine that you're taking in? Are you using it specifically really only when it's needed? And are you aware of the effects that different types of caffeine actually have on your nervous system and on your performance, your body, your mental health, all of those things? So caffeine, definitely not a bad thing by itself, just like most things. But you guys know my whole deal is it's all about dosage and purpose, right? So how much are you taking? What are you using it for? How is it benefiting you or not potentially benefiting you? So that is my small talk on caffeine. So I have a couple of questions popping up in the group. So I'm going to start going through those. Remember, if you have questions about anything, it doesn't have to be just about caffeine. It can be any nutrition related question for you as an individual, or just some general questions. right? That's what today's session is for, is to help you guys answer some of those questions and make sure you get some time with me. So if you have really specific things that you're going through and you want me to answer, we can answer them on our call. All right. So the first question I have popping up is, I'm currently at a service academy going through a hypertrophy cycle with meals being at 3 specific times of the day. What is the best fueling ratio per meal? How does it vary with training day types? So if you're currently at the service academy, then the assumption is that you're doing physical training, probably structured physical training in the morning, most days of the week. And then your training throughout the day is likely a combination of job specific training, which can be very physical. And I'm going to also assume that there's some academic training in there as well. So you can confirm or correct that if you need to. So if you're doing physical training on a daily basis, and then you're also doing potentially training on your own, but then also you're performing cognitive tasks, right? Your energy demand is going to be pretty high. I think sometimes that we forget that your brain consumes about 20% of the calories that you're taking in on a daily basis. So whenever there's additional stress, whenever there's additional cognitive demand, that's going to demand more calories on top of the physicality. And then if we're in a hypertrophy cycle, right? Hypertrophy is typically characterized by high volume training. So the frequency at which you're training, the volume or reps and sets that you're training at is typically going to be higher than, say, something that follows more of a strength model. So the recovery for a hypertrophy cycle can sometimes be more demanding than other types of training. So you really are going to need to take in probably a more significant amount of calories, a more significant amount of carbohydrates to help fuel that training, fuel the brain, fuel the body, and then also make sure that you're stimulating sort of that muscle growth and then your protein intake through muscle protein synthesis. So if you're doing 3 meals a day, the answer to that would be, if you can't control or the food that you're taking in, you're not preparing it, maybe you're not able to spread things out throughout the day like you would like, then the answer there is just you need to eat as much as you can. Right now, you can go into the Performance 101 section inside the database where it says strength, and you can actually download the calculator for calories and macronutrient breakdown. And in there, it will actually tell you how much you need to eat at whatever number of meals that you're eating. So you can change the number of meals to 3, to 4, to 5, and then it'll break down your recommended calorie amounts in there for you. But again, if you're using a dining facility and you can't really control the amount of food that you're getting or the food that you're being served, then the answer there would be you just need to eat as much as freaking possible. Now, in terms of ratios, this will depend also on your individual body type. But in general, if you're in a hypertrophy cycle that demands a lot of recovery, that demands calories for growth, then usually your carbohydrate to protein ratio is probably going to need to be somewhere around 3 to 1, potentially even 4 to 1. So 3 or 4 grams of carbohydrate for every 1 gram of protein. Okay. This will also be dictated. And again, if you use the strength template, okay, this will also be dictated by your body fat percentage, right? So somebody who has some additional body fat on their body doesn't necessarily need to go that high up on the carbohydrate end, right? Because this could indicate that they're having some difficulty with managing, carbohydrates, blood sugar, that kind of thing. So when we're talking about high body fat percentage, we're talking probably closer to 30% or more. If you're someone who's relatively lean, then typically you're going to be able to tolerate a higher carbohydrate intake because your body's going to be more efficient at shuttling some of those glucose molecules that you're going to get from the carbohydrate into the cell, and you're going to be able to use them more appropriately. Maybe you have more lean mass on you, so you have more potential to actually store carbohydrate in the muscle tissue. versus being stored as body fat. So those are things to take into consideration, right? And this call is a good time to ask me those questions, right? But typically in a hypertrophy cycle, also going through the service academy, you're probably going to need to start with a 3-to-1 ratio of carbohydrates to protein. And then you want to monitor your weight, your recovery, your energy levels, your sleep. If you find that you're experiencing a great deal of fatigue, then you are probably going to need to take that carbohydrate intake to 4-to-1. If you find that you're actually gaining body fat potentially at a 3-to-1 carb ratio, then of course you just back it off a little bit and you can go down to a 2-to-1 carb to protein ratio. Again, monitoring yourself for recovery, energy levels, sleep, that type of thing. Okay. Now, during a hypertrophy cycle, I don't typically recommend that you eat less carbs one day and more carbs the next day. When you're training hypertrophy, usually the effects of that training cycle last for 48 hours or so, right? So your body's still kind of in that recovery process. So you need those calories on board to continue encouraging that muscle to grow. So making sure that you're still taking in the same amount of calories throughout the week, regardless of what your training looks like during a hypertrophy cycle, is typically what I'm going to recommend for most people. All right. All right. Some additional questions. Let's look here. All right. And I kind of answered this one already. So when you're taking in caffeine and you're doing operations, you kind of want to focus on making sure that you're spacing that caffeine intake out. Sleep and caffeine, super important. So one of the new things that's kind of coming out is the effects of or how to effectively caffeine nap. So I don't know if you guys have heard about this before, but this is essentially where you are wanting to sort of increase the amount of alertness that you have after taking a short nap through the utilization of caffeine. So by taking in a dosage of caffeine quickly and then taking a 30 to 40-minute nap, what happens is during that nap, your caffeine intake will actually start to, the caffeine in your bloodstream will actually start to increase. And you start getting into that peaking phase during that time so that when you wake up, you're actually more alert. So you can actually try that out. That's actually become a pretty common practice in some of the populations that I work with.